Improve your English through stories. In a charming neighborhood, a rumor quickly spread about a wealthy bachelor who was about to make a significant move. The talk of the town was that a single man, blessed with a considerable fortune, was on the verge of renting the esteemed Netherfield Park. Even without knowing his thoughts or beliefs, families in the vicinity immediately envisioned him as a potential suitor for their daughters. Mrs. Bennet, eager to stay ahead of the neighborhood gossip, excitedly informed her husband of the news. She revealed that the affluent gentleman hailed from the north of England and had fallen in love with Netherfield at first sight. The grand house and expansive gardens made it irresistible. His servants were expected to arrive soon, and he would follow shortly after. Intrigued, Mr. Bennet inquired about the gentleman's name, Mr. Bingley. Mrs. Bennet, in her usual animated manner, shared that he was unmarried and had an annual income of £4,000 to £5,000, making him a delightful prospect for their daughters. Mrs. Bennet, driven by matchmaking enthusiasm, urged her husband to pay a visit to Mr. Bingley as soon as he arrived. Mr. Bennet, however, seemed uninterested in the social formalities and suggested that the ladies of the house could make the acquaintance themselves. Mrs. Bennet, not missing a chance to compliment herself, considered sending her daughters along but pleaded with her husband to make the first move. Mr. Bennet, known for his sarcastic humor, couldn't resist teasing his wife about her beauty and the rules of polite society. Despite her protests, he remained unmoved, asserting that Mr. Bingley would likely be pleased to meet them all. As days passed, Mrs. Bennet continued to press her husband to visit the wealthy newcomer. She even proposed writing a letter expressing their willingness for any of their daughters to marry him. However, Mr. Bennet's sharp wit persisted, and he jokingly singled out their daughter Lizzie as a favorite, much to Mrs. Bennet's dismay. The conversation took a more serious turn when Mrs. Bennet, expressing genuine concern, asked her husband not to write such a letter. Mr. Bennet, ever the cynic, downplayed their daughter's qualities, referring to them as silly and ignorant. He particularly singled out Lizzie as somewhat more intelligent, much to his wife's dismay. The situation unfolded against the backdrop of Mr. Bennet's past mistake, marrying a woman more interested in frivolous matters than intellectual pursuits. Despite Mrs. Bennet's emotional plea, Mr. Bennet couldn't help but be indifferent, foreseeing the arrival of more wealthy suitors in the future. A week later, much to Mrs. Bennet's surprise and joy, Mr. Bennet did visit Mr. Bingley at Netherfield. However, he remained tight-lipped about the encounter, leaving the curious Bennet sisters to rely on a neighbor's description. The mysterious Mr. Bingley was said to be young, handsome, charming, and, to Lydia's delight, a lover of dancing. In the days that followed, the Bennet household buzzed with excitement as they anticipated the introduction to their potential future suitor. The younger daughters eagerly awaited a chance to catch a glimpse of the handsome stranger during his visit to their home. Mrs. Bennet, eager to facilitate a meeting between her daughters and Mr. Bingley, initially planned to invite him to dinner. However, fate had other plans. Instead of a formal dinner at Longbourn, the Bennets encountered Mr. Bingley at a lively social event in the nearby town of Meryton. Residing in the quaint village of Longbourn in Hertfordshire, the Bennet family, especially the girls, enthusiastically anticipated the public dances held in the neighbouring town. This particular dance was highly anticipated because there were whispers that Mr. Bingley, accompanied by friends from London, would be in attendance. As the night of the dance arrived, excitement filled the air, and all eyes eagerly awaited Mr. Bingley's entrance into the room. The Bennet sisters, curious and thrilled, were ready for the opportunity to make a memorable impression on the charming newcomer. Mr. Bingley, accompanied by his two elegant sisters, the husband of the elder sister Mr. Hurst, and another young man named Mr. Darcy, made a grand entrance at the Meryton dance. Mr. Bingley, with his charming demeanour, quickly became a favourite among the ladies, while his sisters were noted for their fashionable grace. However, it was Mr. Darcy who stole the spotlight. Tall and handsome, he was rumoured to have an income of £10,000 a year. Initially admired for his striking appearance, the ladies soon discovered his constant frown and reluctance to engage in conversation or dancing. General consensus formed that Mr. Darcy was proud, disagreeable, and considered himself superior to the local residents. In contrast, Mr. Bingley endeared himself to the ladies by dancing with enthusiasm and conversing with everyone. As there were fewer gentlemen than ladies, Elizabeth Bennet found herself without a dance partner for one of the dances. Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy, standing nearby, expressed his disdain for dancing with a partner, particularly at a village dance. When Mr. Bingley suggested dancing with one of the attractive girls, Mr. Darcy dismissed the idea, except for Jane Bennet, whom he deemed the most beautiful. However, when Jane's sister Elizabeth was mentioned as a potential partner, Mr. Darcy coldly declared her not attractive enough to tempt him. This encounter did not endear Mr. Darcy to Elizabeth, but she shared the story with her friends in a cheerful and amusing manner. The evening passed joyfully for everyone else, with Mrs. Bennet pleased by the impact her eldest daughter had on Mr. Bingley, who danced twice with Jane. However, Mr. Darcy's rudeness towards Elizabeth did not go unnoticed. Later, when Jane and Elizabeth discussed their dancing partners, Jane admitted being flattered by Mr. Bingley's attention. Elizabeth, however, expressed her dislike for Mr. Darcy's proud and horrible demeanour. Despite Jane's positive impressions of Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth remained unconvinced, silently contemplating the unfolding events. Jane, with her kind and gentle nature, always sought to see the good side of people's characters. Despite Elizabeth's reservations, Jane considered Mr. Bingley's sisters with understanding, thinking them perhaps too proud and almost rude. She speculated that they might feel superior to most others, much like Mr. Darcy. However, she chose not to voice her observations further. Following the dance, the Bennet and Bingley families started to visit each other regularly. The exchange of visits marked the beginning of a growing connection between the two households, setting the stage for unfolding relationships and potential romantic entanglements. In just a few days, it became apparent that Mr. Bingley held a strong admiration for Jane, and Elizabeth could sense that her sister was on the verge of falling in love with him. Discussing this matter with her friend Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth expressed relief that Jane's emotions were well concealed behind her cheerful and normal behavior. Charlotte, a sensible and intelligent woman, offered a different perspective. She remarked that Jane's reserved nature might hinder her chances with Mr. Bingley. Charlotte believed that Jane should take every opportunity to attract and encourage him, emphasizing the importance of revealing one's feelings in matters of the heart. Elizabeth, amused by Charlotte's advice, wished Jane success but found herself at odds with Charlotte's views on happiness in marriage. Charlotte argued that happiness was a matter of chance and that knowing as little as possible about one's future spouse was preferable. Elizabeth, skeptical of this approach, laughed it off, convinced that Charlotte didn't truly mean what she was saying. While Elizabeth observed Mr. Bingley's growing interest in Jane, she remained oblivious to Mr. Darcy's developing interest in herself. Initially not finding her particularly pretty, Mr. Darcy began to appreciate the beauty in Elizabeth's intelligent face and attractive figure. Despite considering her just an unfashionable village girl, he felt a growing desire to know her better. At a party hosted by the Lucases, Mr. Darcy, standing alone and watching the dancing, received a comment from Sir William about the entertainment. Darcy, with disdain, dismissed the importance of dancing, claiming that anyone could be good at it. When Sir William suggested dancing with Elizabeth, Darcy politely declined, but Elizabeth also refused his invitation. As Elizabeth walked away, Mr. Darcy watched her with a slight smile on his face. Caroline Bingley approached Mr. Darcy, suggesting that he found the rural gathering boring. However, Mr. Darcy revealed that he was contemplating the pleasure that a pair of fine eyes, belonging to Miss Elizabeth Bennet, could bring. Caroline, with a touch of sarcasm, congratulated Mr. Darcy on his supposed impending wedding, teasing him about having the charming Bennet family as future in-laws. Miss Bingley, noting that Mr. Darcy remained calm, continued to mock the Bennet family in a seemingly amusing manner. In the second chapter, it is revealed that Mr. Bennet has a comfortable income of £2,000 a year and a pleasant house in Longbourn. However, a cloud looms over his daughter's future, as after his death, all his property is set to pass to a distant male relation. Mrs. Bennet, with a meagre inheritance from her lawyer father, has a brother in London who owns shops, and a sister married to Mr. Phillips, her father's former clerk. The Phillipses live in Meriden, conveniently close to Longbourn, and the Bennet girls frequently visit them for social calls or to consult with a dressmaker across the street. Kitty and Lydia, the youngest daughters, are particularly regular visitors, their minds more vacant than their elder sisters. They find amusement in walking to Meriden and hearing the latest local news from their aunt. The arrival of a regiment in Meriden for the winter becomes a source of great excitement for the girls, overshadowing even Mr. Bingley's fortune. Their admiration for the officers leads Mr. Bennet to coolly remark that Kitty and Lydia must be two of the silliest girls in the country. While Kitty remains embarrassed, Lydia continues expressing admiration for Captain Carter. Mrs. Bennet, defending her youngest daughters, argues that youth cannot be expected to have the common sense of their parents. She even reminisces about her own preference for a red coat, suggesting she would not turn down a good-looking officer with a substantial income. Mrs. Bennet recalls Colonel Foster looking handsome in his regimental uniform at a recent event. Amidst this conversation, a servant delivers a note for Jane from Netherfield. Mrs. Bennet, eager to know its contents, anxiously asks Jane about the invitation to dinner. Jane reveals that Miss Bingley has invited her to dinner at Netherfield, as she and her sister are alone, while her brother and another gentleman dine with the officers in Meriden. The news sparks curiosity and disappointment, with Lydia wondering why Aunt Phillips hadn't shared the information about the officers having dinner in Meriden. Mrs. Bennet expresses her frustration, lamenting the missed opportunity for Jane to take the carriage. Upon receiving Jane's invitation to dinner at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet enthusiastically suggested that Elizabeth should ride over, fearing rain might force Jane to stay overnight. Elizabeth, however, proposed that Mrs. Bennet should go if she were confident they wouldn't offer to send Jane home in their carriage. Concerned about the horses being used on the farm, Mr. Bennet eventually agreed that they were indeed needed that day. Jane set out on horseback, and not long after she left, it began to rain heavily. Mrs. Bennet, pleased with her idea, hoped for a downpour. When a servant from Netherfield arrived the next morning with a note from Jane, it was revealed that she had caught a cold on her wet ride and had been invited to stay at Netherfield until she recovered. Mr. Bennet, with his characteristic humor, commented that if Jane were to become seriously ill and die, at least she would have died in a good cause and in obedience to her mother's orders. Mrs. Bennet, however, dismissed the idea of Jane dying from a cold and assured that she would be well looked after at Netherfield. Elizabeth, feeling anxious about her sister, decided to walk the 5 kilometers to Netherfield as the carriage was not available. Kitty and Lydia accompanied her part of the way, heading to visit one of the officer's wives in Meriden. Elizabeth continued alone, crossing fields and streams, eager to reach her sister. Arriving at Netherfield with tired feet and muddy stockings, Elizabeth was shown straight into the sitting room where Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were surprised by her solo journey in such bad weather. Mr. Darcy, torn between admiration for her healthy appearance and doubt about her decision to travel alone, was reserved. Mr. Hurst, preoccupied with his breakfast, said nothing. Elizabeth was quickly taken to her sister's room, where she found Jane delighted to see her but clearly unwell. The doctor recommended bed rest and medication for Jane. Elizabeth spent the day caring for her sister, with occasional visits from the Bingley sisters. In the afternoon, when it was time for Elizabeth to leave, Jane seemed upset, prompting Miss Bingley to invite Elizabeth to stay at Netherfield. A servant was sent to Longbourn to inform the Bennet family and retrieve some clothes. Elizabeth went down to dinner that evening, leaving Jane in bed at Netherfield. Elizabeth observed a swift change in the Bingley sisters' demeanour from apparent concern for Jane to indifference. This only reinforced her initial dislike of them. Among the group, Mr. Bingley's behaviour was the only one she found satisfactory. His genuine anxiety for Jane and politeness towards herself were notable. However, the Bingley sisters treated her like an unwelcome guest. Miss Bingley focused all her attention on Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Hurst joined their conversation. In contrast, Mr. Hurst seemed solely interested in eating, drinking, and playing cards. After dinner, when Elizabeth left the room to check on Jane, she couldn't help but feel a certain discomfort and isolation caused by the less than warm reception from the Bingley sisters. Miss Bingley immediately initiated a critique of Elizabeth's manners, labeling her as both proud and lacking in politeness to her superiors. According to Mrs. Hurst, Elizabeth possessed no good qualities except being an excellent walker. She disparagingly commented on Elizabeth's appearance that morning, describing her as almost wild, with untidy hair and a mud-covered dress. Bingley, however, seemed oblivious to these details and found Elizabeth remarkably attractive. Miss Bingley continued her disapproval, stating that Elizabeth's adventure had likely lessened Mr. Darcy's admiration for her fine eyes. Darcy defended Elizabeth, attributing the brightness of her eyes to the exercise. Mrs. Hurst expressed a liking for Jane Bennet but doubted her chances of a good marriage due to her family's vulgarity. The conversation turned to the Bennet girls' uncles, with Bingley suggesting that even if they had enough uncles to fill Cheapside, it wouldn't make them any less charming. Darcy, however, pointed out that having such vulgar relations considerably lessened their chances of marrying men of any position in the world. Late in the evening, when Elizabeth was sure Jane was asleep, she joined the party playing cards. Despite their invitation to join the game, Elizabeth politely declined and chose to read a book. Bingley offered to fetch more books, praising Pemberley's delightful library, while Miss Bingley expressed hopes for a house as beautiful when Bingley made his purchase. Bingley expressed his eagerness to see Jane again, praising her appearance, manners, and accomplishments. He found her delightful and noted her growth since the spring. Bingley was impressed with Jane's skills and accomplishments for her age, marveling at how young ladies manage to learn so much. Darcy, however, expressed a more reserved view, stating that the term accomplished is often used too loosely. He claimed to know only 6 truly accomplished women. Elizabeth then challenged his definition, suggesting that an accomplished woman must possess qualities such as knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, modern languages, along with a certain grace in walking, speaking, and behavior. Darcy added that an accomplished woman should also focus on improving her mind through wide reading. Miss Bingley enthusiastically agreed with Darcy's criteria for an accomplished woman. Elizabeth, however, expressed her skepticism, stating that she wonders at Darcy knowing any accomplished women, given his stringent criteria. Bingley praised Jane's elegance, intelligence, and knowledge, expressing that he had never seen such qualities in one woman. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley vehemently protested, claiming to know many women with similar attributes. However, Mr. Hurst redirected their attention to the card game, ending the conversation. Later, Miss Bingley commented to Darcy that Elizabeth was one of those women who try to appear attractive to men by undervaluing other women, describing it as a mean trick. After Jane's recovery, Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by her 2 youngest daughters, visited Netherfield. Elizabeth, however, regretted this decision as her mother displayed a lack of intelligence and common sense in her conversation. Kitty and Lydia's behavior also left a bad impression, with Lydia rudely pushing herself forward to request Mr. Bingley to hold a ball at Netherfield. Elizabeth and Jane stayed another night at Netherfield, and during this time, Elizabeth observed Mr. Darcy frequently looking at her. She assumed he was criticizing her, as she couldn't believe such a great man would admire her. Despite her slightly mocking manner, Darcy responded with quiet politeness. Miss Bingley, jealous of Elizabeth, increased her anxiety for Jane's recovery in the hope of getting rid of Elizabeth. Eventually, Elizabeth and Jane returned home, with only Mr. Bingley showing genuine sorrow at their departure. Mr. Darcy, relieved, was determined to conceal any sign of admiration for Elizabeth. Miss Bingley, however, expressed warmth and friendliness during their goodbye, promising to visit the Bennets soon. While Mr. Bennet welcomed his daughters back, Mrs. Bennet was disappointed they had returned so soon. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet's cousin and the future inheritor of his property, wrote a letter expressing his desire to improve the relationship between their families. Having recently become a priest and gained the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, he secured the position of rector at Hunsford, a village near Lady Catherine's estate in Kent. In the letter, Mr. Collins flattered himself for acting correctly in offering his friendship and assured Mr. Bennet of his commitment to encouraging peaceful living in the community. Despite the concerns about the inheritance causing financial difficulties for Mr. Bennet's daughters, Mr. Collins proposed to visit on Monday, November 18, at 4 o'clock and stay until the following Saturday week. He claimed that this arrangement would cause him no inconvenience, as Lady Catherine did not object to his occasional absence from his duties. Mrs. Bennet, initially excited at the prospect of Mr. Bingley's visit, was disappointed to learn that it was Mr. Collins. She expressed strong dislike for him, particularly due to the unfairness of the inheritance situation. Mr. Bennet, however, decided to welcome Mr. Collins and read his letter aloud to the family. The letter outlined Mr. Collins' intentions, his new position as a rector, and his hope for a friendly relationship with the Bennets. Mr. Collins arrived at Longbourn, and the family was surprised by his formal and serious demeanour. He had recently become a priest and secured a position as a rector in Hunsford through the patronage of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In his letter, he expressed a desire to improve the relationship between the two families and offered his friendship to the Bennets. He mentioned his concerns about the financial future of Mr. Bennet's daughters due to the inheritance situation and promised to make amends. Mrs. Bennet was initially excited, thinking the visitor was Mr. Bingley, but when she learned it was Mr. Collins, her excitement turned to disappointment. The family discussed Mr. Collins' letter, and while Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain the legal situation, Mrs. Bennet remained resentful about the inheritance. Mr. Bennet, however, decided to welcome Mr. Collins, and they anticipated his visit. When Mr. Collins arrived, he complimented the Bennet daughters on their beauty, expressing his hope that they would soon be well married. He acknowledged the hardship posed by his inheritance and promised to admire the young ladies. The family proceeded to dinner, during which Mr. Collins praised the house and furniture, leading Mrs. Bennet to assert their ability to afford a good cook without her daughter's involvement. Mr. Bennet engaged Mr. Collins in conversation, and the latter spoke enthusiastically about Lady Catherine de Bourgh's considerate behaviour. Mr. Collins spoke highly of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, portraying her as kind and treating him almost as an equal. He mentioned Lady Catherine's advice on marrying as soon as possible and how she had invited him to dinner at her house. According to Mr. Collins, Lady Catherine had even visited his small house and offered suggestions for improvements. He described Lady Catherine's residence, Rosings Park, which was located near his house. Lady Catherine was a widow with one daughter, a charming young lady in weak health. Mr. Collins expressed his duty to please Lady Catherine and frequently complimented her daughter, considering it a way to fulfill his obligations. When Mr. Bennet inquired about how Mr. Collins prepared these compliments, he explained that some came to him naturally, while others were occasionally prepared during his spare moments. Mr. Collins claimed to be an expert at flattering with delicacy, and Mr. Bennet found great amusement in his cousin's foolishness. As the day progressed, Mr. Collins read to the ladies, but when Lydia interrupted him, he refused to read any more. Despite this incident, Mr. Collins was determined to marry one of the Bennet girls as a way of making amends for their future financial troubles. Initially, Jane was his choice, but after a brief conversation with Mrs. Bennet, he shifted his attention to Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet was delighted with the prospect of having two daughters married, and Mr. Collins became a favourite in her eyes. Elizabeth had an interesting encounter when Lydia suggested a morning stroll to Meryton to explore some offices. Everyone, including Mr. Collins, joined the excursion. While Mr. Collins delivered self-important speeches during the walk, the younger sisters quickly lost interest, eagerly scanning for officers upon reaching Meryton. Their attention was caught by a new, gentlemanlike face, Mr. Wickham, who arrived from London to join the regiment. With a friendly introduction, the group engaged in delightful conversation. However, the arrival of Darcy and Bingley on horseback added an unexpected twist. Bingley showed interest in Jane, while Darcy, attempting to avoid Elizabeth, noticed Mr. Wickham, leading to a surprising and colorful exchange of expressions between the two men. Elizabeth's encounter with Mr. Wickham stirred her curiosity. As Lydia proposed a stroll to Meryton, including Mr. Collins, the group encountered a new face, Mr. Wickham, who recently joined the regiment. His officer's uniform added to his charm, making him the center of attention. During a pleasant evening, Darcy and Bingley arrived, with Bingley showing particular interest in Jane. Notably, Darcy and Mr. Wickham's faces revealed a surprising reaction upon seeing each other. Later, Mrs. Phillips invited the Bennet family, including Mr. Collins, to a supper party, where they met Mr. Wickham again. Mr. Collins, always eager to compliment, praised the size and furniture of the house, unknowingly impressing Mrs. Phillips. As the evening unfolded, the Bennet girls found Mr. Collins tedious and eagerly anticipated Mr. Wickham's arrival. When Mr. Wickham joined the party, his charm captivated everyone, especially Elizabeth. Throughout the evening, he engaged her in delightful conversation. Eventually, he shared information about Mr. Darcy, revealing a strained relationship due to past grievances. Mr. Wickham expressed a desire for Mr. Darcy to leave Netherfield, emphasizing that he would not be driven away by him. Intrigued, Elizabeth listened to Mr. Wickham's tales about Meryton and its charming inhabitants. Mr. Wickham revealed more about his past, disclosing that he had initially aspired to a church career in Derbyshire. However, due to Mr. Darcy's interference, he lost the opportunity to become the rector of Pemberley, a position promised to him by Mr. Darcy's father. Elizabeth was horrified by Mr. Darcy's unscrupulous actions, considering it wicked and unjust. Mr. Wickham portrayed Mr. Darcy as a proud man, driven by jealousy and disdainful of promises. Elizabeth was appalled by the revelation, expressing her disbelief in Mr. Darcy's behavior. Mr. Wickham further explained the unfavorable character of Miss Darcy, describing her as excessively proud and accomplished. Elizabeth pondered the irony of Mr. Darcy's close friendship with the amiable Mr. Bingley. The conversation shifted as they were joined by others, becoming more general. Later, Mr. Wickham inquired about Mr. Collins's acquaintance with Lady Catherine, hinting at Lady Catherine's plans for her daughter's marriage and inheritance. Elizabeth found amusement in the thought that Miss Bingley's efforts to win Mr. Darcy's favour might be in vain. As the supper party concluded, Elizabeth couldn't shake off her thoughts about Mr. Wickham. She shared the details of their conversation with Jane, who, in disbelief, struggled to reconcile the Mr. Darcy she knew with the one described by Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth received an invitation to Mr. Bingley's ball, eagerly anticipated by all the Bennet ladies. Even Mary, usually devoted to serious reading, welcomed the prospect of some relaxation and amusement. Elizabeth, looking forward to dancing with Mr. Wickham, tried to be kind to Mr. Collins when he requested her company for the first two dances. However, she couldn't shake off the worry that Mr. Collins might have matrimonial intentions. On the evening of the ball, Elizabeth was surprised and disappointed to discover Mr. Wickham's absence. She suspected Mr. Darcy's influence, especially when learning that Wickham had been invited but was called away on business. Annoyed with Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth's initial encounter with him was less than polite. However, determined to enjoy the ball, She endured awkward dances with Mr. Collins. Unexpectedly, Mr. Darcy invited Elizabeth for a dance. Astonished, she accepted, and they danced in silence for a while. When Elizabeth encouraged conversation, Darcy remarked on the size of the room, leading to a playful exchange. Darcy hinted at their similar unsociable nature, causing a momentary coldness when Elizabeth mentioned their recent encounter at Meryton. The conversation became strained, and Darcy struggled to speak. During a dance, Elizabeth sharply remarked to Mr. Darcy that Mr. Wickham had lost his friendship due to Darcy's actions. Darcy remained silent, and their conversation ended shortly after. Seeking relief, Elizabeth joined Jane and happily listened to her sister's account of her feelings for Mr. Bingley. However, the overall behavior of the Bennet family during the ball left Elizabeth embarrassed. Mr. Collins, eager to establish a connection with Mr. Darcy, received a cold reception. Mrs. Bennet, with her usual lack of discretion, loudly discussed her hopes for Jane's marriage to Bingley during supper, causing further embarrassment for Elizabeth. Mary's musical performance, unfortunately, did not add to the family's reputation, being received with less enthusiasm. The rest of the evening provided little amusement for Elizabeth. She couldn't escape Mr. Collins, who remained by her side, delivering long speeches. Fortunately, her friend Charlotte Lucas occasionally rescued her from Mr. Collins's attentions. The night concluded without any further interactions with Mr. Darcy, which Elizabeth considered a relief.